You know that feeling, right? When you're completely lost in a game. And not just because the action is great, but because you're hooked on the world, the characters, the story. So what's the secret? What's the hidden code that designers use to pull us in so deep? Well, today we're diving into exactly that. How video games tell stories and turn simple challenges into experiences you'll never forget.
Now, you might think this is a no-brainer, but for years, this was a huge debate. Seriously. Is a game just a fancy competition, a bunch of challenges to beat, or is it a totally new way to tell a story? This question, it gets right to the very core of what a video game even is, and it really sets the stage for this constant tug-of-war between pure gameplay and a killer narrative.
So, here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle the big one. Why bother with stories at all? Then, we'll get into the weeds of gameplay versus narrative. After that, we'll check out the actual blueprints for game stories, see how designers make your choices feel important, and then we'll hit the final level, the big takeaways. Okay, let's start with that great debate I mentioned. For decades, you had these two camps in academia going at it. On one side, you had the ludologists, who basically said games are all about the rules and the play. On the other, the narratologists, who saw them as a new form of storytelling. And while they were arguing, the industry just kept on making games and found some pretty practical reasons for a good story.
So why bother? Well, it pretty much boils down to 4 solid reasons. First, stories give you context. Suddenly, you're not just shooting at pixels, you're saving the galaxy. That emotional connection is huge. Second, that emotion helps attract a way bigger audience. Third, if you're playing a game for like 100 hours, a story keeps things fresh. And finally, and you can't ignore this one, stories just plain sell games. It's way easier to market a hero's epic journey than a really satisfying gameplay loop. Now, to really get a handle on game stories, we've got to understand these two different and often opposite forces. They both create that feeling of what happens next, but they are built out of completely different stuff. Let's call them dramatic tension and gameplay tension.
First up, you've got dramatic tension. This is storytelling 101, the stuff from books and movies. It's that pit in your stomach when you're totally invested in a character. You care about them, you're worried for them, and you just have to find out what happens. It's the engine that drives basically every story you've ever loved.
And then there's gameplay tension. This is a whole different beast. This is all about the desire to beat the level, to solve the puzzle, to win the match. It's born from the challenge itself, and that uncertainty about whether you can pull it off. Can I make this jump? Am I going to win this fight? That's gameplay tension, and you don't need a single character for it to work. And here's where it gets really, really interesting. These two types of tension, they're basically opposites. Think about it. If you saw the same scene in a movie over and over, the dramatic tension would be dead. A totally random, meaningless event would just ruin the plot. But for gameplay, repetition is how you get good. And randomness is what makes games like poker or even Tetris so addictive and fun to play again and again. This line from the sci-fi show Red Dwarf just nails the point perfectly. One character is trying to tell a fascinating story about a board game he played, listing every single dice roll, but his friend points out that the interesting bit, rolling a specific number, is really just as dull as any other random roll. The player felt intense gameplay tension in that moment, but for anyone just listening, it has zero dramatic weight. It's just numbers. Okay, so knowing that fundamental clash between gameplay and story, how in the world do designers actually build a narrative into a game? Well, let's look at the blueprints. They usually fall into one of 3 main styles. First up, we've got the most common approach, the linear story. Think of it like a train on a track. Your actions as the player push the story forward, sure, but you can't change the destination. The beginning, middle, and end are all set in stone. Games like The Last of Us are perfect examples. You control the journey, but the final outcome is fixed. Now, I know linear can sound like a bad word in gaming, but hold on, it has some massive advantages. For one, it's way, way cheaper to make because you only have to build one path. The code is simpler, so you get fewer bugs. And here's the kicker. Because the storyteller has complete control, a linear story can often deliver a much tighter, more focused, and way more powerful emotional punch. Now, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have the branching story. This is the big dream, right? True interactivity, where every major choice you make can send the plot careening off in a totally new direction, leading to a whole bunch of different endings. But that dream, well, it comes with a nightmarish price tag. It's something called a combinatorial explosion. If you have one choice with 2 branches, and then each of those has 2 more branches, the amount of stuff you have to create just blows up exponentially. It gets insanely expensive and complicated fast. Plus, you get this weird side effect where players might have to intentionally play badly just to see all the different story paths they paid for. So how do you solve that problem? Well, the industry came up with a really clever solution: the fold-back story. This design gives you choices that lead you down these short, different paths, but then, eventually, they all fold back into the main storyline at key moments. It creates this amazing illusion of freedom while keeping the story and the budget from spiraling out of control. Most big modern RPGs use this model. So we've seen the structures, but within those structures, how do designers pull off the magic trick? How do they make you actually feel like your choices have real weight? Well, it all comes down to one incredibly powerful idea.
And that idea is agency. Agency isn't just about pressing buttons. It's about feeling like you have the power to actually change the story. You can affect what's going to happen next. A totally linear story has pretty low agency, while a true branching story has really high agency. The goal for most game designers is to give you just enough agency to make you feel like you're a co-author of your own adventure.
A perfect example of this in action is the dialogue tree. You've seen it a million times. It looks like you're having a real conversation, but it's actually a pretty slick system. You, the player, get a menu of pre-written options. You pick one, and the character on screen delivers their own pre-written response, which then brings up a new menu. It's a structured illusion, but it works. It lets you shape the conversation and gives you that awesome feeling of control.
All right, we've gone through the theory, we've looked at the blueprints, and we've seen it in practice. It's time to head to the final level and nail down everything we've talked about.
So what are the big takeaways here? 1. Stories aren't just window dressing. They give games emotional weight and bring in way more people. 2. You have to remember that gameplay tension and dramatic tension are totally different animals. 3. Story structure is a deliberate choice, linear, branching, or fold back, and each one has huge trade-offs. 4. It's all about creating that feeling of agency, making the player feel like they matter. But finally, and this is the golden rule of game design, the gameplay has to come first, always.
And that brings us to our last big question. As technology gets crazier and game worlds get bigger and more complex, what's the future of storytelling in games going to look like? Will that elegant fold-back structure just keep getting better? Will someone finally crack the code on a truly branching story that doesn't cost $1 billion? Or, in a world with endless gameplay possibilities, will we even need pre-written stories anymore? That's something to chew on the next time you pick up a controller. Thanks for tuning in.